But something you also said, which I think is really the bedrock behind selling, and you talked about it in your talk a little bit, which is you just said it now. How would I feel? So, and like you said, there's an underlying emotion behind every sale. There's always something behind that door. And you also said that to sell from a, like, to know that you're always going to be happy with what you're selling is to sell. I just want to make sure I say this right. What are you, that to make sure whatever you're giving them is worth more than what they're paying you, because then you don't feel like I'm not taking, I'm giving, and I'm giving probably even more than what you're actually paying for. So that's why I feel like, I guess that what gives you that sense of fulfillment in a way. And one thing you were talking about when you were working at that other company and you that coaching program and you just felt bad about selling that kind of product and so on, is that you're like, the example you use is like, I closed that client, but I felt bad afterwards. You actually went experienced some depression afterwards. So you felt like something was taken away from you. And what I didn't consider before is that in a sale, it's not just a transaction of money. There's so many other factors that go into that, like emotions and so on. So could you walk us through what are some of the other, I guess, factors that go into a sales transaction that maybe we're not paying attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I first start is I define selling in a different way. And maybe I've been in the personal growth industry that gives me permission to use these more fun terms, but I'll explain it here in a way that can be concrete, even if you're someone that's non-spiritual and a hardcore salesperson, because you'll get this. Selling is nothing more than an energy exchange between conscious beings. All right. So selling is an energy exchange. That's it. And then energy is a great word because it really encompasses anything that'll go in the process of a sales transaction. Most people thinking goods or service is going to be exchanged for money. Now, the easiest thing to look at is money itself, right? Money is nothing more than stored energy. Like if we went into ancient times and let's say I wanted to sell you a pair or sword. I want to sell you a sword, and then you would be like, "Well, I have these chicken eggs. Would you like to trade 12 eggs for a sword?" And I'd make a decision like, "Oh, okay, is that what I want? Is it worth the sword?" And now we have to translate, and it's very complicated. And the most amazing invention that happened in our humanity, I think, is this tool that we were able to create called money. Funny, some people think it's the root of all evil. I think it's the greatest gift we've ever received as humanity because it allowed us to store energy. Because if you were trying to sell your eggs and you didn't have anybody buying them right away, that you didn't want to buy the sword, you're like, oh, maybe I'll buy it, but then your eggs go expired, your energy got expired. But because we created these marketplaces that allowed for capital to become these vast amounts of stored energy, we could start directing this energy into things that we wanted to create in the world. I mean, this is probably the best and most beautiful definition I've ever seen of venture capital, is really mobilizing energy into creating what you think should be created in the world. Now, when I talk about energy, money being stored energy, products and services are also energy. If you think about a product, like I'm sitting on a chair, and let's say this chair is made of wood. Well, the wood had to come from a tree that needed to be cut down, that needed to be refined and processed and distributed and sold. That took energy to create. You even took natural resources that are energy in its form. So every product is a product of refinement of raw material that is all energy that was used to create it. People had to work at it. People had to make it happen. And now the other one that I like to speak about is time. And the funny thing is, like time is money, but actually they say time is more valuable than money. And the only reason is this: where money can be stored energy, time is active energy. Because the moment it's passed, it's gone. So it can only be used in the moment it's available. And so when you put everything down in a unique formula where everything is energy, you have time, you have the product or the service that took time, took money to create, took raw material, energy, all that is being exchanged for the stored energy, the money. But here's where I add something special, which is there's another variant in the equation, which I called emotion. And a lot of people talk about emotion being energy in motion. And so there's an emotion in a sales transaction, and I break it down into 4 levels, and I've talked about the first one already, which is SGBs, the shame, guilt, blockages. Like if you've ever stepped into a sales transaction and you know the person's selling you a bad product. Like they're not excited about selling you. You feel what the seller is selling to you even when you walk into the room because there's a vibe. And these are typically the shame guilt blockages. And those can come from various sources, namely having your own fears of rejections, your fears of identity. Maybe you don't want to be a salesperson, but you're forced to be one and you feel shameful about doing it. Maybe the product you're selling is crap and you know you're selling more problems the moment they buy it. And then guess what? You're going to be shameful about having to do that because nobody wants to go and take advantage of another human being by nature. It's not what we want, you know? But we're often forced, or we feel like we're forced to get into those circumstances. So the lowest vibration is shame and guilt. And both you as a seller, you'll actually block the whole sales transaction because every transaction creates more shame and guilt, and it blocks you from even wanting to initiate a sales process. You don't want to pick up the phone to follow up. You don't want to write that email. You fear the person walking into the store because it'll trigger those traumas. Now there's ways to heal that. What I usually explain to people are things like, hey, guess what? These blockages actually come from our childhood. You know, if it's not the caricature of the used car salesman that we feel we step into the identity of, maybe as a child we were quote unquote natural salespeople, quite shameless kids asking for what we want until a moment arises where parents, you keep asking, going, Mom, Dad, please, 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 can I have this, give me that? Little salesperson, but actually a really bad one because you're selfish when you're a child. You don't think about who you're selling to, you just want what you want, right?
For
So
sure.
at some point, parents end up saying, no means no, stop asking. And if you've done any kind of RTT hypnosis therapy, you know that at that time is where you're most imprintable. And so if an imprint that says, when I ask for what I want and demand others to give me what they have, I will not be loved. I will be hated. I will be rejected. That leaves an imprint that makes a lot of people fearful of sales. So that's a part that you really need to heal. Now, moving beyond that is where I call it the FPP, or the fear pride paradox. And this is where a lot of people get dangerous with sales. So when you're operating from this level, the fear pride paradox is really when you start falling in love with the process of selling, but maybe nothing else. Maybe you've learned this idea like, ooh, look at that. I can do the magic. I can move people. I can control. And now you have this neediness around selling. You have this validation that comes from selling. And that's where people can be dangerous because people are looking for clarity today. And a person that understands the sales process, follows a set of scripts, understands human psychology and nothing else, can do a lot of movement with the energy, but it comes at a cost. Because if you've manipulated people into making them make a decision that wasn't in their true service, you're going to feel like crap about it. Like maybe not now, which is again why I see there seems to be a tendency around addiction issues, around people that sell from this emotion, whether it's drinking, alcohol, or drugs, or sex addictions. Like this is usually things you would characterize around high performance salespeople that might be selling from a place of pride. Because what happens is you're not taking responsibility for your sale. You're just making it because you know it brings the results you want. So that's the second layer. And the buyer is left with less. Like now they're more fearful about salespeople. They got manipulated. They have a negative impression around sales. And they were left with giving up more energy than what they received in return. They feel like crap too. And the other person, that's the seller, just decides to numb themselves to this reality. But it seems to catch up after a while. And anybody who's been in sales, like I explained my example where I ended up doing these sales at a very young age, you have that realization that it's not right. Like sometimes you're being ignorant in the process, but there are better ways. But the problem is people usually go to this third level, which I call the rational sabotage, right? Is once you decide to say, hey, I can do better. I want to make sure that I'm selling things that truly make, sense for people to buy. But you've been so jaded with understanding how you've manipulated people that you fall to this this rational sabotage. And what happens here, it's interesting, is you'll get into a sales process and you'll just like vomit all the data on the buyer, right? You'll just like be like, hey, you can buy this Lamborghini, but I know it's a little more expensive than a Toyota, but it's still a really fancy car. I don't know if you're looking for a fancy car, but it makes you look good, but I don't know if that's what you're into. And like an over-talkative salesperson, you've probably seen the type, and they're trying to rationalize everything. And what's interesting is the reason you start doing is because you feel like you're responsible for telling them all the information for them to make the decision. But rather, you're not taking responsibility for the sale you're about to make. You're trying to give that responsibility to the buyer. And the buyer doesn't want it. The buyer is coming to a salesperson so that they can have a resource that they can trust and be responsible for holding them by the hand and making them make an educated purchase. And that's where most people feel that these are the only options available. you're like, oh, I'm either having these shame and guilt blockages, or I'm selling like an a-hole with these fear pride paradox where I'm just manipulating people. And when I try to be the nice guy or this nice girl and I sell from this place of rationality and I give all the data, well, people don't buy as much. Your sales numbers start going down when you've actually went up in the vibration. So you're like, what's going on? And that's why I say that the best emotion to have is be able to sell with love. And when you sell from a place of love, that's what most people don't think about. It's not in your sales books, it's not in your sales literature. But what happens is you decide to care. You decide to take responsibility, and you're willing to risk it because your intentions are based in a place of love. You have a love for the impact. You love the buyer that you're selling to. You love the product that you're selling. You love the sales process too. And you have self-love. So guess what? You become relentless. You become enthusiastic. You can jump up and down and be going to that person saying like, I'm so glad you walked into this place because there's a really strong chance that exactly what you're looking for is right here. And I'll be the one to help you. And people go like, damn, there's a new energy in the room. And that's what happens when the sales process is actually filled with love, is you'll feel it and the buyer will feel it, and everyone will walk away from that transaction with love on both sides, and it gets maximized, and it makes the fucking world a better place. Sorry, I just dropped an F-bomb there. Sorry.
This is your show. Drop as many as you'd like. It's all good.
We'll stick with one.
First of all, man, the way you're speaking about money and time as a stored energy, that is something I've never considered before. And the examples that you mentioned made perfect sense, especially looking how it was in the past and why it has provided so much value. But like you said, it's just a tool, and with time, unfortunately, with time, it's active, and you can't, as everyone says, time is the one resource that you can't get back. But also looking at things like the fear pride paradox, the rationale thing, you've really like there's so much I've learned from this conversation and about sales. I've gained such a new perspective on it, and it really looks like you've taken the time to dive deep, really deep into the psychology behind what are the blocks that people have? Where is this all coming from? Is it personal? Is it from the client? And so on. But